NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
So I'm going to talk about language impairments. And as you can see, I say they matter really. And I'm going to also lay a guess that there's something that most of you have never heard of. And so today you're going to get a 1-hour discussion of something that there's, I'm sure that I could fill my house, your house, and a few other people's houses with the amount of scholarship that's actually on this. So I always find it kind of disconcerting that, in fact, as lawyers, we really don't know very much about it. I'm going to give you the backstory because in a lot of ways that's the easiest way for me to help you understand what this is actually about. For a long time, I represented the deaf community. I had done some publication on representing deaf people, and it was just it was something that I was very interested in. One of the things I knew is that what really gets people, deaf people, is the lack of access to language, and that leaves them very often with a language deficit, not an English language deficit, a deficit of any kind. They don't necessarily have American Sign Language, they don't have English, and they're kind of left out in limbo. This is a very old picture, obviously, of one of our state mental health facilities. It no longer looks like that, I can assure you, but they have what's called the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center. And the director said to me one day, you know, we're getting a lot of kids with articulation disorder. Their speech is kind of off. They were just having some real interesting issues and we can't understand it. And I said, oh, well, maybe they've got hearing deficits because that's what I was interested in. Well, they actually tested them and I went out and met with them and they said, not one of our kids is showing up with a hearing deficit. And I thought, oh, well, that's odd. And they said, but while we've got you, you might want to know that we ran some language assessors on them. And almost all of them are showing up below average. And there's about at least a quarter to a third that are showing up in the bottom 10% of the scores of kids their age. And I kept thinking, what is that? What's that about? I didn't understand it. I mean, and I thought, well, I work at a law school. I am going to check this out. I'm going to see what this is about and see if maybe there's something to this. And let me tell you, this is what I discovered. I was absolutely startled. I felt like I had pulled back a rock and there was a whole world out there. A whole world that has been around for 100 years and that we know nothing about. And I'm including myself. And I got to tell you, I always thought I was a pretty good lawyer. And suddenly there's this whole world out there of language impairments or language disorders. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. And so I'm going to share a little of it with you. So the first thing I had to get used to, because remember I just said, I think I'm a pretty good attorney. And in many ways I am, but guess what? I'm not all that good. We do believe as lawyers, we do believe we are communication experts because language is all we use. It's all we got. We're not doing blood tests. We're not doing air quality tests. We have language. And so we have come to believe that we are communication experts. And we judge people based on their language. We judge their credibility. We judge how much they understand. We judge them using their language. We decide, well, what's your human motivation? What's your intent? We make judgments up one side and down the other about how people use language. And in turn, that tells us what kind of person you are. But the reality is that for all we depend on language, and I bet there's some English majors in here, and we take it for granted, we actually don't know very much about it. What it is as a neuropsychological, a neurocognitive function, and what it means to our functioning as a human being. And so that was the first thing I had to learn. And as I said to my co-author back at that time, I was trying to go through this stuff. I said, this is making my eyes bleed. It's tough, it's difficult, and yet at the point when it comes in and you realize, wow, how did we not know this? So what am I talking about? Language impairments, what they are, where they come from, why they matter. All right. You're going to hear them called many different things. A pretty standard term in the United States is language impairment. Within the speech language profession, you're going to start to hear developmental language disorder. You will hear deficits, disadvantage. It's all, for my purposes, it's all talking about the same thing. And what I'm talking about is oral language competency. The ability to use language to, spoken language. I'm going to leave deaf people over at the side for a minute because I recognize there is a different issue with signed languages, but it's the ability to use spoken language to navigate through the world. It is developmental. Language is developed. It is not learned. It's acquired or it's developed. Think back to when you were 4 to when you were 3. I'm going to guess you weren't hanging around the dining room table learning how to diagram sentences. You picked it up and we developed it, and somehow we develop it so that by the time we're in kindergarten, an average kid has a vocabulary of about 13,000 words. They've got syntax, they've got grammar, they've got language in place, and that's by the time they're 5. So when we're talking about a disorder, what we mean is that these individuals have not developed competency in one or more aspects of language or language use, that something didn't click, that something didn't turn on, something that was meant to automatically turn on at 2 or 3 or 4 did not. And there's a number of things that can cause it. There can be processing deficits, neurocognitive deficits, physiological deficits, and you can also have environmental factors. The kind of things we're talking about for this particular series of presentations tends to be processing, neurocognitive, and physiological, but we cannot ignore environmental factors and how they play out in this. So this is a new way of thinking of language. There's multiple different facets, and what you start to get a sense is this is complex business. This thing that we do without even thinking is one of the most complex, almost miraculous creatures on this earth. Human language is dense, it's broad-ranging. The presence of us can make us tell jokes, and it can help us smooth things out. And when it doesn't work, you're going to run into trouble. And to a certain extent, what I'm talking about is what happens when we run into trouble. So you saw that. So what exactly is a language impairment? When you take that huge block with all those different aspects in it, what does it mean when your language is impaired? And it means some one of these things isn't working. Your expressive ability. Well, what I'm doing right now is I'm expressing. Your ability to say what's on your mind, your ability to describe what happened. That's what breaks down. Receptive ability is comprehension. And it is not just vocabulary. Can you comprehend the series of things that I just said to you? Can auditory discrimination or processing, and that refers to, can you sort out by hearing what it is that I've just said? And it isn't just about pure sound. It's about, can you process it and turn it into a usable product? Auditory memory. If you don't have language, if your language is below par, below grade level, if you want to put it that way, you will have a difficult time remembering what you have been told. And the example that I can think of is, put me into a science class. Somebody could give me a lecture on, something involving chemistry. I would have forgotten it by the time I went out the door because I don't have the language or the knowledge to understand what in the blazes you are talking about. Semantics, which is the understanding of word meanings. It also includes inferences. We speak a lot by inference. We would drive each other crazy if we came in and gave every piece of context underlying our basic message. Obviously, vocabulary, grammar or syntax, that's the structure of how things are set up. And then I've got this in green because in the law world, this is huge. It's a deficit in your narrative ability, your ability to tell what happened, what you saw, why it happened. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about this because in the law world, this is huge. It can make the difference in the quality of justice. I want to talk about this. This is pragmatic deficits. I know that you are talking about some of the spectrum disorders. And one of the things that certainly marks autism is deficits in social communication, the ability to use language as a tool to navigate through the world. Pragmatic deficits teach us the rule of engagement. You could call it good manners, but it's more than that. It really is, how do you engage with a human such that that interaction is meaningful? It's kind of a what to say when. We all know people. Look, I'll be the first to admit I have made no shortage of verbal faux pas. But I know they're wrong. Usually it's when it's coming out that I know that it's wrong. But with a pragmatic deficit, you may not know. This is not the time. Now is not the time to be saying this. Reading social cues. And that may be facial expression. That may be tone of voice. That may be upturn, downturn. That may be physical. So there's many social cues that people with pragmatic deficits have a hard time with. Understanding the perspective of others. We all think about, if I'm trying to explain something to somebody, it's like, what do they need? And what do they need to understand? And what happens when another party, so let's say that I'm talking to somebody who's got a pragmatic deficit, and they do something that I interpret as rude. Well, that's where the problem comes about. It isn't just that they said it. It's an equation. You said this and I reacted to it this way. I have now completely misinterpreted what you're doing and what you mean because I'm putting them through my own lens. So who gets these suckers? Who gets developmental language disorders or deficits? And by that, I'm talking, we can talk causation. What's, comorbidity, some of the disabilities that we're talking about in these sessions are causative, but some are just simply comorbidity. Sometimes it's just, where is there a high rate? What's the interaction between the two? We don't know, they're just found. Or you're going to see risk factors. What are the risk factors that seem to be present that indicate a very high likelihood or a very increased likelihood of language disorder? ADHD. Depending on the studies, there is sometimes up to a 90% overlap between ADHD and a language disorder. Does ADHD cause it? They don't actually know. For our purposes, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter. Very often, these are pragmatic deficits, but not entirely. You will see vocabulary deficits, syntactical deficits, so a range, and very often you'll see narrative deficits. Learning disabilities. Well, number one, this is a learning disability, but kids with learning disabilities become adults with learning disabilities, and very often language deficits travel along with it. Early hearing loss, and even a moderate hearing loss. And that has to do with exposure. That means that because a kid with a moderate hearing loss isn't going to pick up all that kind of indirect communication that all of us have come to depend on in our lives for learning how to get through the world. In order to talk to a kid with a hearing loss, a hard of hearing kid with a hearing loss, you have to talk directly to them. Well, if you got kids, you know that your kids are, you're talking to them from the other room or they're listening in from the other room. Auditory processing deficits, I think of that as kind of brain deafness, meaning that if you do a standard hearing test, which is just sound, sometimes called pure tones, they'll pick it up. But what hearing is in fact is the sound coming in, your brain's doing something to it. So you are processing it. And I think we've all had clients who have auditory processing deficits, meaning the signals are scrambled. Autism spectrum disorder, we talked about that earlier. One of the hallmarks of it, in fact, basically one of the criteria for it in DSM-5 is social communication disorder. Meaning they've got deficits or something breaking down in their ability to use language as a tool to just be social creatures. Cognitive deficits. In order to develop language, you have to have cognitive ability to do it. And where that is not present, or where there are deficits in it, the language acquisition process will fall short. It just will. Behavior disorders. This comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but you're going to find especially kids, adolescents, and then growing into adults, you will find people with behavior disorders very often have language deficits, that there is a connection, a very powerful connection between behavior and language, and that where language is missing, the behavior disorders come up. This is well recognized in Canada, by the way, where if you have a kid in school who is having behavior problems, one of the first things they do is test them for language deficits. Kids who are abused or neglected, very high rate of language deficits, particularly when it comes to regulating their emotions and expressing their feelings, that it just completely breaks down. Childhood trauma. Now, this cuts out with kids who don't have disabilities, kids who do, but guess what? It creates a very serious disability. What we know is childhood trauma affects neurocognitive functioning. And language is a neurocognitive function. That's where it comes from. And so it gets right in there. It's almost like it's like a direct assault. And so you are going to tend to see, when you're talking childhood trauma, you will overwhelming likelihood of seeing language effects of that trauma. And it's going to be intertwined with executive functioning effects, the behavioral effects. We know that it hits language of emotions. Again, how do you feel? So they have a very hard time with emotions, with regulating them, and then with behavior. And that is, in fact, a communication function. Just so that when we see it, adult trauma can affect language ability, but it is not developmental. And it's actually a very different specialty among speech language pathologists. I'm going to talk about this, poverty. I mean, poverty exists whether we're talking about kids with disabilities, individuals with disabilities or not. It is something that you must understand how the special impact that it has. First of all, let me make this really clear. I am not talking about poverty itself, but those conditions that come with it. So there's going to be overwhelmingly a low education level of caregivers. It's very chaotic. Housing insecurity. Are you moving around a lot? The extraordinary stress in the household. It can be very isolating. What are the schools? Who's attending what schools? I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, that the quality of schools in a particular neighborhood is very hooked in with socioeconomic status of the people that live there. It just is, because of the way funding operates. And it is, again, poverty itself does not cause trauma, but it may be intertwined with it. If you look at at ACEs and what the scores are, you're going to see that trauma can come with poverty, and that's how you're going to end up with these kind of language issues. I am talking about very poor. I'm not talking about being in law school and having to live in, student housing and eat ramen. I'm not talking about that. I mean, hardcore multi-generational poverty. It has nothing to do with linguistic diversity or choice. Nothing. That's not the issue. And race and ethnicity is absolutely, positively not a factor. And what I like to see is a few years ago, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel did a study on childhood trauma and trauma within certain areas in the state. And they ran a whole series on Milwaukee, which I think everybody expected was going to show the highest rate of trauma as measured by the ACEs score. It did not. Out of 72 counties, it scored 11. The highest scores were in our very poor white rural schools. And by the way, those are tough schools, those rural schools. So again, it has nothing to do with race or ethnicity. So here's this, one of the things, I'm trained as a lawyer, as I like to tell people, I'm fundamentally not a scholar. I'm a lunch bucket public defender. And I had to read a lot of articles, and consult with a lot of experts. And so I've been able, as I like to say, that I read this stuff so you don't have to. Developmental language disorder has been implicated in other words, it's a factor in causing some of the following things: cognitive deficits. Just as you have to have cognitive ability to acquire language, if you fail to acquire it, it can cause further cognitive deficits. It can cause further breakdowns in your ability to process information. Verbal memory deficits. Can you remember what you were told? No. No surprise, long-term academic deficits. I mean, what else is there in school but language, right? I mean, even if it's talking about math, it's still language. Literacy deficits. Language, think back to kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. Think back to learning to read and compare the difference between your spoken language and what you were learning to read, and it took a while for it to catch up. Starting kindergarten, you had 13,000 words. You did not have the ability to read 13,000 words for the most part. I'm sure there's somebody who did, but for the most part, no. And the literacy deficits become a bigger problem because up to about age third grade or so, you're learning to read. Well, around that time, maybe third to fourth grade, you switch over and you read to learn. Only if the literacy has never kicked in, you're going to start to be further and further and further behind. Makes it easy to understand then why you would have anxiety disorders. Something's going on in this world and you're being left behind. Higher rate of psychiatric disturbances, very high rate of behavior problems, particularly certainly among kids, adolescents. It becomes lessened somewhat with adults, but it is very much an issue, especially with kids. You're going to see impulsivity, and the reason for it is think about this. All right, I'm going to talk to my defense lawyer friends out there for a minute. You've all had days when the judge is being less than you'd like the judge to be in a particular case. Now, there's a part of you, no doubt, that would like to jump up on the table and, and let loose with an F-bomb. All right, I'm going to tell you, I've had those moments. Well, how do I not? How is it that I don't do it? Well, I actually I language myself out of it. Michelle, that's a really, really bad plan you got going there. Very difficult for people to understand and follow directions. And we've all had this of, well, wait, I just told you. I told you last week. Gone. Inability to read social cues. And then antisocial behavior, especially reactive aggression. These are all the things that this stuff causes. It is a factor in it. So obviously, this is very, very, very serious business for anybody who's involved in the criminal or juvenile justice systems. It doesn't go away. These continue into adulthood. They're often thought of as disorders of childhood. They're not, they don't go away. All of the effects continue. It doesn't matter where you're looking or the kind of research, it's true everywhere in this world. Everywhere in this world, the same thing. And it doesn't matter the kind of research that you're doing, One of the things that I think is fascinating for people who do juvenile, it is believed, especially by a researcher in Canada named Dr. Joseph Beachman, that school's a stressor because of the language demands of school, and then the behavior demands that go with the language, that it actually causes a lot of people to have some serious problems. All right, here, this is like, well, duh, right? These people are, increased rate of conviction, incarceration, revocation, you name it. Here's the rate in the general population. It's going to be higher than you think for something we've never heard of, 7%. In juvenile correctional institutions, depending on where you look, you're going to get it at 50 to 80%. Adult correctional institutions, again, it depends on where, but you're looking at over 35%. This is true in other countries. And by the way, speech language professionals have known this for, I'd say, 100 years. I found an article from 1920 that talked about kids in a home for wayward boys, or whatever it was called back at that time. And they said, there's language problems in here. There are language problems in here. That was written in the 1920s. These are by Dr. Beachman from Canada, so you can see it. These are the percent of participants in his study group, and he had a very, very, very large study group that he did. But the kids who were diagnosed at 5, and SL is speech language, kids diagnosed at 5 who were arrested by 19. Language refers to language disorders. Take a look. Dark green is the control, no language disorder male. Take a look, then we did double in of the language disorders. Again, close to double with the females. Very, very, I mean, it's huge. It's huge. Here it is, the reason for the first time in trouble for the law. It's very interesting. Notice, by the way, substance abuse, that's the control kids. That's people for control. But when you've got crimes of aggression or somehow deemed violent in any way, misdemeanor, felony, notice the distinction here. And you're looking at blue is, as he calls it, language, green is the control. So it's the presence is really dramatic. For if anybody's here is doing law enforcement, any dealing with victims, any prosecutors, this is not just offenders. I put it in quotes because I really hate that term. Dr. Beachman has done some research showing that girls and women with language impairment are at a higher risk for sexual assault. And we should bear in mind the victims and witnesses will come from the same family or social grouping, and they will, by virtue of many of the same environmental, socioeconomic factors, perhaps some of the genetic processing issues, there's going to be a higher likelihood of language impairment. So among your witnesses, you've got this same thing going on. How do we know? Where does this come from? I mean, what is it that I'm talking about? This is, this isn't strunk and white, elements of style. What am I talking about here? All right, speech language pathologists, you'll see a slide that says this, they are your friends. This is a little understood profession that should be part of what we do. They should just be part of our teams. But there are specialized tests, and they are normed. They run them by age group. But in addition to doing tests, they do a clinical assessment, meaning they watch tapes of them, they listen to them, they deal with them, and they watch them in context. And so they start to understand what is it that you can do. The cool thing is that even a middling speech language pathologist is going to give you information on all of these skills, whether it's the ability to understand what you're saying, including complex sentences, by the way. Can they remember what you said? Can they tell a story? Can they process what you've just told them? This is amazing information to get, and it's not information that we're really used to having. All right, language impairment does not equal verbal IQ. VIQ is verbal IQ. They are related, but they're very, very different. Language has a lot of dimensions, and if you look at a verbal IQ score, it doesn't account. an 88 doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't account for the layers of language. Let me say this. We hear a lot about full-scale IQ. In the context that I'm talking about, that has nothing. It doesn't mean anything. And nonverbal score means even less. I don't care how somebody did on putting blocks together, because that's not what we're doing in the criminal justice system. So when you look at language instruments, they actually really tear apart communicative competence. And they give us a very clear notion of what can this person do, what can't they do. Among them, again, I'm going to go back to narrative skills and following directions, because we need people to be able to do both. And it can be present with a person with average or even above average IQ. We certainly see this in people in the spectrum disorders. You certainly do. Generally, let me say this, IQ within a lot of mental health professionals, IQ's almost a joke. Like, why would anybody pay attention to it? And it really isn't understood. I mean, the one thing I'll say is, we talk about, well, his IQ is average. It's 100. That's not all that great. It just isn't all that great. And when a judge says, well, he's got an IQ of 62, so therefore he can understand, it's like, wow. I mean, that to me is a sign we really don't know what these numbers mean. So none of us, I haven't heard of it. Maybe, one of you has, but I had not heard of this stuff. And most legal professionals have not. It is, and frankly, part of the problem is that it has been unidentified. It hasn't been treated, and it has been wildly misinterpreted. The saying is it's the most common disorder you've never heard of. Remember, it's 7% in the general population. That's high. That's high, and yet you've never heard of it. It is invisible. It doesn't have a look. If any of you watched Making a Murderer and watched the interrogations of Brendan Dassey, you'd have seen a kid who didn't say a lot, but what he said made sense. It seemed logical. It seemed to follow. And if you are not familiar with language impairments, it's actually very, very difficult to recognize it. They have learned to pass. The last thing they want to do is show you their deficiencies. It's certainly by the time they reach adolescence. You saw it with Brendan Dassey. Behavior issues favored, and what that means, particularly when you're dealing with kids in school, is if they're a behavior problem, the schools are going to go after that. Courts are going to start to look at that. You're a behavior problem. You're a behavior problem. It's more appealing to deal with the behavior problem than to start to look underneath to say, is there something deal here? It is easily misinterpreted as all of these things. Either you're non-compliant, you're not cooperative, you've got a bad attitude, you're rude, you're weird, you don't talk enough, you talk too little. It's very, very, very easy to misinterpret what this stuff is. So here we go. When language impairments meet the law. And I gave a list. Who wants to know? Everybody who deals in the criminal justice system wants to know. I write for and tend to present to defense attorneys because Bonnie said, that's what I did. But everybody needs to know because it affects all of us. I want you to just see this. I'm going to show you, this is a quick slide that I give to defense attorneys to show you as a legal matter where I think this matters. And I'm just going to run this up. You get a copy of this if you really want to study it, but you can see this is huge. I think these are areas that are so affected by a client's language impairments. And that's a lot. Narrative deficits. I told you I was going to spend some time on it. Given that we tell stories for a living, and given that we are dependent on other people telling stories, whether it's a witness, whether it's a client, we all depend on this. So what is it that they do? And I love this. They significantly fewer bits of information. It's not that they can't tell you anything. They can, but there's a whole lot that's missing. friend of mine gave me a perfect example. I was doing some research with lawyers trying to figure out, well, how do you guys deal with them? Do they mean anything to you? And she said, oh yeah, narrative deficits. I know them well. He got in my face, so I shot him. Bang. Yes, that is a narrative deficit. It is a narrative. Yeah, it's a narrative. It tells you something, gives you a little cause and effect, but we don't know what it means. And of course, it's very easy to misinterpret. If you're not careful, it's very easy to say, well, obviously you're a gangbanging thug, as opposed to perhaps this was pure up self-defense. They can say things, but it's going to tend to be and then, and then, and then, and then, and then. Much context is missing. Where, when, where, how did this, what was the context? What was the, what was the immediate preceding event? So when they tell it, that stuff is missing. Cause and effect is missing. Things just seem to happen. It's got kind of that, you're looking at it and you can't get any sense of where did this thing go? Certainly an emotional layer. My reaction to this was. And part of the problem is they really have a hard time understanding the perspective of the listener. What do you need to know to make sense of the narrative? I will tell you, think about this. Think about stories that you've told to a couple of people where you've told the same story 2, 3, 4 times, and how you know to change the story depending on the listener. What does that person need to know? What does that person need to know versus what does this person over here need to know in order to make it? We know how to do that. A person with these kind of deficits doesn't even dawn on them that that's something that has to happen. There are a lot of pitfalls of narrative deficits for interviewers. And you've got to be very, very careful. First of all, it's very easy to find yourself getting an inaccurate or incomplete narrative. You may also be getting yourself a false narrative. They are easily led. You'd be amazed how easy it is to plant content, even if you're not trying. They do tend to be more vulnerable, more suggestible, the more compliant they're going to go along with you because they're dealing in essentially a foreign land. They are confused by the kind of language we use, whether it's inferences, compound questions, abstractions, very confused by interruptions. As a lawyer, I think we've all know this. Well, how did that make you feel? Or what were you thinking? Those are horrible questions. That's like turning to me and saying, tell us about quantum physics. That's just not what they talk about. There are special techniques. And in order to get complete narratives, you're going to need an expert and special training. And I'm going to tell you now something I'll talk about again later. The United Kingdom has started to recognize this and actually has special procedures for people with language deficits. Forensic assessments are not good at this, good at picking this up. I think we've all, in some capacity or another, seen forensic assessments. A speech language assessment is overwhelmingly not included. It's not even thought of. Psychologists, psychiatrists are not familiar with it. And you can say, well, how do you know that? And I'm going to say, you'd be surprised who's told me that he or she never even thought of it, that it never even occurred to them, and that they really don't know very much about it. Speech language is much more nuanced and long range. Whether you're talking about auditory memory, that's, ask me again, pragmatics, narrative ability. Very often they'll say, well, they can relate facts. It's like, no. Yeah, the facts aren't that big. Yeah, they're important, but we need the narrative ability. Can they give one? Can they follow directions? And it goes beyond developmental issues. Traditionally, you see a lot of people say, well, at 15, the things they sort of develop into some kind of competency. This goes way beyond 15. So one of the things that they talk about decisions, the way that they ask them, it's very odd. If you're deciding whether you want hamburger for lunch or a tuna fish sandwich, which do you want? A tuna fish sandwich. Well, they can make decisions. Making decisions based, when you're talking about other people's reaction, is very much a communication function. IQ doesn't tell it, and that includes verbal IQ. Very often you're going to see, well, their IQ is, their IQ is around 80, so they should be able to do it. That doesn't tell us anything about what this person can do. We all get this. Well, if you just talk slowly, it doesn't fix it. I mean, I know that I talk fast and I can talk slower if I am absolutely pushed, but that's not fixing it. That's not what this is about. We're often told, just repeat or use simpler language. Again, that's not the fix. And competency school, to my defense attorneys out there, we all know about competency school. And the fact that someone learns to recite what a judge does and a prosecutor does not make them competent in the real way that we need. Let me talk about this for a minute, because perhaps just, my own self-importance. The quality of communication in the attorney-client relationship really can make or break the quality of justice. And this really can be deadly for people. First of all, it makes it very hard to work within the attorney-client relationship. And I put down here, it's a principal-agent relationship. We, the lawyer, are the agent. This person who struggles with life is the principal. So already you're seeing how very, very difficult it can be. Narrative skills. My ability to do my job is dependent on my client's ability to deliver a solid narrative. If all I'm getting is he got in my face, so I shot him, I got some trouble. How well do they understand the legal process? And that's very complicated. It's not just a vocabulary test. There really is a fund of knowledge. It's about processing, the ability to remember, to draw inferences. It's pretty complicated business. Can they make decisions? How well do they make decisions? And then empathy and trust. My empathy for the client, because I'm here to tell you, language impairments can make people very, very difficult to relate to. And then their ability to trust me, because I might be nothing more than a cardboard cutout to them. And I'm going to say this again and again and again, because defense attorneys are constantly exhorted, well, just explain it. Just repeat it. Or here, counsel, I'll give you an extra 15 minutes. That's not what this is. That's absolutely, positively not what this is about. I'm going to show you something with some language that you're all very, very well acquainted with, and that's Miranda. We all take Miranda for granted, right? What do you need to know to understand Miranda? Well, you got to know the vocabulary. You have to be able to follow complex sentences and long passages. You have to understand concepts, abstract concepts like you have the right. Yeah, go home and tell your kid what a right is. See how well you do. You have to have a fund of knowledge. What are they talking about when they say use this against you? It doesn't matter that very often it's like, well, they've seen it on TV. As Tom Grisso has figured out, you don't understand it any better from seeing it on TV. In fact, to quote my friend Herschella Conyers, who does a lot of serious juvenile defense in Chicago, she says, oh yeah, my clients have seen it on TV and they know what it means. It means they're going to jail. It makes, you don't understand it better if you've been through the system. It doesn't, to quote the late Chief Justice Rehnquist, doesn't matter if it's part of our national culture, people don't get it. And a series of tests, it's not understood even with college students who do not have language impairment. It also needs, by the way, auditory processing. Can I understand what you're telling me? And to follow directions. That's Miranda that we just take for granted. And here's no surprise. Do you understand? Do you understand is one of the greatest leading questions of all time, because there's only one correct answer, and that is yes. I'm going to show you just show you the Wisconsin standard rules of supervision so that we can start to go ahead and laugh. I'm aghast. But we use forms to inform all over the place, right? So I'm just going to show you. This is all people who are put on supervision in the state of Wisconsin must sign this thing. And I'm just going to show you a few pieces of it. All right. This is the thing that is to be signed, read and signed, attested to by anybody who's put on supervision, whether it's probation, whether it's our extended supervision coming out of prison, whatever it is, boom, you got to have this. Okay. So the first thing I did is I did a very crude assessment that just comes from Microsoft Word, the readability statistics. This is what it looks like when it pops up. And it is very crude, but it tells you, it gives you a basic sense. Is this thing accessible or isn't it? If you looked at the numbers, here we go. Words per sentence, 20.1. Reading grade level, 13.3. That's college. The informed consent regulations in the nation require an 8th grade reading level, and that's generally acknowledged as way too high. So we're already way out of this. Reading ease, 32.1. And that means how accessible is this thing? We're looking at, are there clauses? Are there dependent clauses? Do these things relate back? Here we go. The higher the score, the easier it is to read. So 90 to 100 be very easy to read. 60 to 70 easily understood by 13 to 15-year-olds who did not have language impairment. We're at 32. That basically says this thing is unreadable by anybody. Because I'm going to guess if you looked at that stuff, the previous slide, you looked at it and thought, I think we got to, wait, what? All right, what are the problems with it? It's over-inclusive. It's very long. I only gave you a little bit of it. It's vague. What are you talking about? It's abstract. It's how many words would you like? If you read it aloud, it doesn't make it any more understandable, and neither will explaining it. It's too much. It's too much. It's too much. And there was some studies of probation officers in Australia who admitted that they knew that their clients really probably were having verbal problems and certainly couldn't understand the written materials they were given. Here's some of the other forms that don't inform. These are the ones we're used to. Bail, guilty plea waiver forms. Those are some kind of thing. Your right to appeal, policies and procedures manuals when you go into a correctional facility. Reading them to somebody won't fix it. Neither will explaining it. It's hard. These things are hard. And let's face it, who made those forms up? We all know who made those forms up. Judges made them up. Lawyers made them up. In some of the instances, it's, legislators made them up. And, we could talk about what's the reasoning and what are they trying to do? That's way above my pay grade. All I know is that those things are not accessible and they really don't inform anybody of anything. How do you recognize this stuff? I'm going to tell you, number one, overwhelming likelihood that it will have been previously unidentified. Nobody's picked it up because because it is the most common disorder you've never heard of. What risk factors are present? When there are risk factors, any of the risk factors that I talked about earlier, if they're present, means heads up, pay attention. Are they showing behavior problems? Could well be a sign. Do they have social problems? They have a hard time with friends. Do people think they're weird? What do the school records show? Sometimes schools do pick it up. And schools do have speech language pathologists. Brendan Dassey from Making a Murderer, there was sitting in his file a speech language assessment from 6 weeks before the homicide occurred. And it said, it was a bad one. Verbal IQ will be a clue. It's not dispositive one way or another, but it's certainly a clue. Are the people forgetting instructions? Do they seem confused when you use non-literal language, including inferences? Real hard for me. I love metaphors. I love talking about, this, that, and the other thing. And you could just see people go, what is she saying? People who talk a lot but say little, that's actually a way of covering. People, if they don't ask questions, whether it's a client, whether it's a probationer, whether it's a suspect, are they not asking questions? Are they not answering them? Are they missing your cues? We give off verbal cues all the time. Are they missing them? Maybe somebody seems difficult. Now, I understand people can be difficult without having a language impairment, but this can be a sign that one is present. And then, of course, you have your thin narratives. He got in my face, so I shot him. And you're having a tough time getting anything else. Speech language pathologist is your friend. This is definitely something we're not used to. It's a profession we don't know. Get to know them. They do, as you can see, the person I wrote the Brendan Dassey article with is a PhD level speech language pathologist, and she refers to them as going under the hood. They break down, like, wait, what's going on under here? And they're going to go down in detail. Make sure it is the correct specialty. You want somebody who specializes in developmental language deficits. If you've got somebody who's got a concomitant disorder, whether you're talking about any kind of intellectual disability and any kind of autism, you want to be looking for someone who's used to dealing with speech language issues within the context of that disability. They will review records. They can look at things and see things that we do not know how. They will test. They'll do clinical observations, sitting there talking with the person. It's not just pure tests. They can help do a better interview. They can explain, they can watch an interview and say, here's what I think is going wrong. They can help you because they have studied interviewing, which, believe me, is a science and an art. They can also do discourse analysis, and they can listen to recordings. They can actually really start to break down the language used by both parties to the communication, not just the individual with the language impairment, but the other person. In the courtroom, they certainly qualify as expert witnesses. That's easy. That part's easy. They are also, could be amazing when it comes to witness testimony. First of all, we've got to get it out of our head that the way we examine witnesses in courtrooms has anything to do with enhanced communication. It's nuts. Try to give a story, tell a story under the rules as we want to. It is nuts. They can talk about credibility and impeachment. We love to, we all do this. We impeach. Well, back then you use this word, now you're using this word. And then we go ahead and we get the instruction. It's like when somebody's got real language problems, asking them, verbal consistency, that's just cruel. They can be an expert witness on the language of the defendant versus the prosecutor when a defendant testifies. You can be an expert witness on how hard it is to testify. They can help you, and I don't care whether you're prosecutor or defense, they can help you. How do I question this person? They can help the jury as witnesses understand some of the credibility things. Why is their language changing? Why are they suddenly saying, I don't know? Can you get a protective order? Should there be a special jury instruction? I'm going to tell you, this all exists. These last three things exist in the UK. The UK on this one is way ahead of us. All right, I get this question all the time. Where do I find a speech language pathologist? Because it really is something we're not used to. Colleges and universities, most of them have a speech language pathology department. At Wisconsin, it's called the Communication Sciences and Disorders Department. And there's two levels. In order to be a clinically certified, you have to have a master's. And that's very, very common. Overwhelmingly, colleges have master's levels. Some schools have PhD level, which is what Wisconsin does. If the person's been in special ed, look in the file. There's a speech language pathologist attached to this local school district. Even Brendan Dassey had access to one in the Mishicot School District in Mishicot, Wisconsin. So they've got it. And there are companies that contract for disability determinations. And they have them. And because this can, depending on the score, you can get yourself some disability payments based upon this. So these are the places where you would find one. They are new. The profession is new to dealing with the legal system, but they're starting to recognize, hey, I think we've got something to offer here. So you may have to do a little extra work to get them to work, but you'll be. The best expert witness I ever saw actually was a speech language pathologist. She blew two very experienced forensic psychiatrists right out of the water. I mean, it's amazing. In other countries, I'm putting this in because I want people to understand it. There really is some stuff happening. It's not happening in the United States yet, and this is my campaign. Number one, the peace method of interrogation, which is the UK and Canada's alternative to the Reid technique. And I put preparation underneath peace because P is preparation. Like, who is this person that I'm talking to? Is there something special that I need? It is an alternative method, and it's highly trained. The difference in training between this and Reid technique to how to interrogate somebody, I mean, you are not off the blocks accusational. It's like, I want to find out if, I want to find out what's going on here. So it's very, very different. But an even bigger thing happening over in the UK is the use of intermediaries, and they are communication specialists, mostly speech. They call them speech language therapists there. You're talking about a witness with this. It's going to be for all stages, all the way into the courtroom. For suspects in Northern Ireland, they back it up. They say, yeah, you get one in the courtroom, you get one here. They also give it in interrogations. If there's a problem, someone's going to be sitting in there. They also have started bringing them into their prisons, recognizing that a lot of their rehabilitative needs really are connected with their communication ability. So briefly, this is my new favorite current event, Zoom and masks. Even if you're all back full time, I'm going to lay odds we're going to start to do more remote, and this can be a real problem for people with language deficits. They're going to miss a lot. They just are. And if you don't believe me, think about when you're on the phone, how much information you actually paste together. We all miss things on the phone, and so you're taking a guess. Teleconferencing will diminish the visual cues, especially if there's a lot of people on the screen. The sound isn't great. The masks are covering the face and they muffle speakers' voices, and it leaves them with words. So understand, I'm not saying never use them. I'm just saying understand the limits of what they can do and adjust your expectations accordingly. Is there treatment? Yeah, there is. Because I remember doing a presentation on this at the law school, and one of the doctrinal faculty saying, my God, aren't these just dangerous people who should be locked up? It's like, oh, I better deal with this. Treatment can improve social skills, the ability to work with other people, to engage with other people. Their literacy can be improved. And they tend to go together. You improve oral language skills and you improve your literacy at the same time. I will warn everybody, watch out for cookie cutter behavioral treatment. We use a lot of it. For a while, Wisconsin was big on cognitive behavioral therapy. It's verbal based. Pretty much every kind of therapy we do when someone comes into corrections is verbal based. But if you have one way of doing it, it is not going to work. Where you have workbooks, they are a problem. You really have to get experts involved in setting these up in ways that make them accessible and meaningful if we are to really make any kind of progress. Here's some rules for you. I'm going to leave you with a few rules. We really have to disabuse ourselves of the notion if I tell somebody something, they understand it. They are not one and the same. If I tell them all I did was say something, you cannot, especially with these people, assume understanding on the other part. More words doesn't mean you understand it better. They love it. Have you explained it? Have you explained it? It's not going to be a fix. Interviewing is hard. It's an art. It's a science. We actually, in no way, give it the credit that it deserves for what has to be done in order to get this right. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes a lot of training. And I'm going to put this in.
I don't want to be unmuted.
It isn't a 1 hour presentation. And frankly, it's not going to be a 1 day presentation, even if I do it. All right. This is hard. It's hard. There's whole graduate courses on how you actually do this. Remember this too. There is a connection between language and behavior. Just because you see some people, they're acting out. It's like, that may be telling you something, and it's something to pay attention to. And here's the final one. We aren't experts. we do make judgments all the time about people based on what they say and how they say it. And, I mean, humility is not what I do best. And I've really had to come to we aren't necessarily experts. And this may be something's going on that I don't understand, that doesn't fit my way of looking at the world. This is where you find me. This is who I am. If you go to the link is my law school webpage. I am retired. They call me, clinical professor of law emerita. Emerita being from the Latin meaning she retired just in time. But if you go there and you look on my webpage, you'll see something called scholarship. You can link there, and there's going to take you to the SSRN, which is Social Science Research Network, and my articles are on there. There's including the Brendan Dassey article. There's the article about the specifics of dealing with language impairment as a lawyer. And then going back, there's the one that's called Breakdown in the Language Zone, is a discussion, just sort of an overview of language impairments with a whole lot more detail. And yes, because it's a law review article, more footnotes. So thank you for taking this time, for letting me come and talk. I mean, I don't know if any of you know who Amy Semple McPherson is, but if you do, you know that, you know who she is and what she did. And I like to say that I'm Amy Semple McPherson, coming around, and I'll talk to anybody, anywhere about this subject forever. When I'm 99, they can trot me out and I'll still be talking about it. So thank you very much.